Hi, this is David Thornburgh, President and CEO of the Committee of 70. Welcome to Studio C70, which is our podcast and webcast platform to talk about some of the issues that we care about that relate to strengthening our local democracy. If you're curious, superimposed in back of me is our Volkswagen, which is the official Volkswagen of the Committee of 70, which is unfortunately parked in my driveway for the time being. But is itching to hit the road later this year to get out and serve as sort of a mobile billboard for a lot of the issues that we care about. So today, we're really thrilled to be joined by Amber McReynolds, who is the CEO of the National Vote at Home Institute. Welcome, Amber.
Hi, how are you?
Great.
Thanks.
Uh, I'll give you a little background about Amber, and then I hope we'll have a great conversation about the issue that she is championing that is newly and urgently relevant to a lot of states, including Pennsylvania. As I said, Amber is the CEO of the National Vote at Home Institute. She comes to that from, I think, a really interesting background as both a practitioner and a thought leader. She ran elections in the city of Denver for maybe a little over 10 years, Amber, and was well recognized and applauded for her efforts. Just a quick scan of her bio, I was particularly noticed that she was named one of Governing Magazine's, may it rest in peace, Public Officials of the Year in 2018. And having worked with the folks at Governing, I know what an honor that was. But enough background. Let's go to the source. And Amber, let's start out with a little bit of your backstory, in particular, your tenure as director of elections in Denver. Is this a job that you always wanted to have? And what did you learn from that experience that's helpful to you in this role now?
Sure. Well, was it a job I always wanted to have? I don't think I knew the job existed when I was young. But I did study political science and speech communications and was very involved in government and politics and the study, if you will, of that in college. And then when I got out of college, I went and did my master's in London. I actually remember going and observing the London elections office counting ballots during one of the elections that I was there. But also while I was there, I was an overseas voter and missed an election because my ballot didn't arrive soon enough to me. And it
Yeah.
was before UACAVA, before YAMUVA, before some of the provisions that were put in place for voters. So I actually experienced what it meant to not be able to vote because of my logistical considerations. And when I came back to the United States, I actually worked for a group called New Voters Project during the 2004 presidential election, and I was assigned in Iowa to be one of the coordinators, one of the regional coordinators. And we were a nonpartisan nonprofit, and we were simply focused on helping students on college campuses across Iowa engage with the civics process, making sure they were educated, getting them help with registration and voter registration. And that job really showed me, number one, how difficult and how many obstacles there are for everyday voters to engage with the process. And then it also demonstrated how much work we really had in front of us to streamline some of these processes to make it easier for voters. So in that work, I traveled to Denver quite a bit and was doing trainings there, and I loved the city and decided to try to search for jobs in the elections world since I had gotten I just developed a love for it and came across a job at the Denver elections office. And it was an operational coordinator job. I applied for it and started working there, and they gave me the responsibility of managing the vote by mail processes, including the overseas voting processes that I had once experienced in a different way.
Yeah.
And I managed that entire thing. And then over time, I kept suggesting new ideas and trying to suggest ways to improve things. And then I became deputy director and then director of elections in 2011 and served in that role for a little over 7 years. And in that time, we were able to transform the voting model in Colorado to include automatic ballot delivery, same day registration, vote centers, automatic registration, and also risk limiting audits. And I was able to lead not only on the policy side and helping voters or helping the legislative body draft the provisions that would become part of that law, but then also implement it as an elections director and help and aid my colleagues across the state also implement those laws. And we did it very quickly because the law passed in May of 2013, and we had a statewide election in November of 2013 that we had to prepare for. So, in addition that to sort of running the process, I also transitioned various models and systems. So I know what it takes to do it quickly. I know what it takes to do it in a stressful environment, and was served in that role in Denver until the fall of 2018, and then joined the National Vote at Home Institute as CEO. And part of the reason, first, it was a very hard decision for me to leave the Denver elections office. And I love the team I built there, and they're still, I think, one of the most incredible teams in the country. But part of my sort of thinking in leaving is that I could help others think about how to improve these processes and help other states and help other local election officials. And so for me, I've always wanted to continue to have an impact and help voters vote. And this was a great way for me to do that.
Yeah. Well, as I said at the outset, I've been impressed by both your sort of operational and systems thinking, and also your sort of ingrained impatience to figure out ways to do things better. So that's a
Yeah.
rare that's a rare combination. Most people who
Yes.
understand the systems uh, maybe become a little defensive about the systems and sort of
Mm.
don't want to change. So kudos
Yeah.
kudos to you for working on both fronts.
Yeah, I think continuous improvement is key
Yeah,
for us to continue to make voting more accessible and more secure and more transparent for everybody.
yeah. So before we get into what we're really here to talk about, which is voting at home and the opportunity and the challenge that we're presented with, just a little sidebar. I've been curious since I started doing this work about 5 years ago that election administration just doesn't get much respect. It
Right.
feels like it's twice, people see it as a twice a year pop-up enterprise. When it comes to allocating resources or making budget decisions, they're hard-fought dollars. It doesn't always attract the best and the brightest in government. The technology community is kind of treats it like an also ran. So maybe the hopeful spin is, uh, do you think there's some opportunity now that we'll start to look at that business differently?
I do. I think that there are incredible people that work in this process across the country, and they do the best they can with
Yeah,
the frankly bad policies that are in place in most states. I always kind of say that there's a lot of great election officials doing many great things with one hand tied behind their back because they don't have good policies to deal with, and we're seeing that right now as more and more people are requesting vote by mail ballots. We're seeing the burden that falls on the local election officials, and they're often underfunded, as you mentioned. It's an environment that is a little bit resistant to change, not because election officials don't want to change, but actually because policymakers don't want to change.
yeah,
And part of the reason for that is they get elected in a certain environment, and they're less apt to want to change that given that they won. And so
great point, great
I,
point.
I really think that we have to, in amongst all of this crisis, we also need to be talking about how we can, um, in essence, pull elections out of that partisan environment that frankly has hurt it for too long and has hurt it for decades, because that's really the only way we can get folks operating at a better level and a higher level in terms of continuous improvement and things like that, and pulling the partisanship out, because it has to be about who votes, not who wins.
Exactly.
And the primary problem with all of this is that election officials want to do good things, but they are, frankly, their hands are tied behind their backs half the time because of bad policies.
Yeah. Well, and without dipping our toes too far into the partisan waters, I suspect you agree that partisanship and the overlay of suspicion that permeates this process seems like it's getting worse rather than better. But we'll look forward and look hopeful.
Yep.
Let's talk about voting by mail. You know something about Pennsylvania. I would call Pennsylvania kind of a traditional voting state. Our election code was written in 1937, at a time when I remind people that um, you know communities were more dense. Everything sort of operated at the neighborhood scale. Uh, Voting was kind of a community endeavor when you all showed up, and there's good old Mrs. White at the polls working behind the desk, and
Hmm.
uh, you can almost see everything in black and white.
Right.
And things are changed, and now obviously we're in this public health crisis. So with that as and we're not alone in that. This probably describes a lot of how the various states and counties and localities have the culture of voting over the years. So when you size up that situation, and how does voting at home, which I think you rightly characterize as voting at home and not voting by mail, it's voting at
Hmm.
home. How does that improve people's lives? What difference does it make? How could this create a better culture of local democracy than the one that maybe we're used to?
Yeah, well, a few things on that. I mean, the whole goal that we've had with voting at home and the changes in just how we've tried to improve that process is um, not to take community away, but to think about community in a different way.
Hmm.
And so, what vote by mail, as we vote by mail, meaning mailing a ballot out to every voter, vote at home, meaning voting in your home. What that really offers folks is not only convenience and also security, because I've also been sharing that in a lot of ways we mitigate risk by delivering the ballots to everybody in where they are and meeting them where they are, instead of this model of forcing everyone to go to a location that they're assigned to, that could be something could happen at, or there could be a physical threat to, or any of those things. So voting in person has a ton of vulnerabilities that have been present over time, and the pandemic has exposed another significant vulnerability that exists with in-person voting. So voting at home is really about convenience. It's also about mitigating risk. It's also about improving the election administration process, and by streamlining some of these things, just like in the business world. If you make things easier for your customer, you're also able to realize efficiencies on the back end from an operational perspective, reducing call volumes into customer service hotlines, all those things when you streamline the customer process. So it's very much about that. And then the community aspect of it is an interesting one. A lot of people will say, or a lot of folks that maybe don't like vote by mail, or vote at home, will say, well, you're taking the community aspect away. Well, I actually think we're increasing that. And the reason why is, if you get your ballot at home, number one, you can engage with your friends on Zoom now, or in other ways, and talk about issues. And maybe those friends aren't assigned to the same polling location that you have, but they're across the city, or they're in different networks, for instance. And we saw that happening actually in Colorado, where people would host ballot parties and ballot and beer parties, and they'd host online chat forums with their friends and talk about issues that their community was voting on, or candidates. And so I think looking at it more in that way is a much better and a much more productive way to look at it, because community can still be there, family can still be there. I've always enjoyed voting my ballot and having my kids sit next to me, and I walk them through what this means to do. And then if I'm not sure about a judge, or I'm not sure about a particular thing, I'll look it up and I show them how to do that research. And I know I'm building lifelong voters by approaching it that way. So I think there's so many positive aspects to this on how it can actually build community in a different way than the traditional way of showing up and seeing your neighbors, per se. And part of that also is, we have a more interconnected community, meaning online or on social media channels or any of those things than maybe we used to. And so I think thinking about it in a different way and looking at the real advantages that come with vote at home systems that can actually create community,
Yeah.
especially in a pandemic or a bad situation.
Yeah, as you suggested, it just requires you to think about community in a different way.
Yeah, that's right. Just
But
like we're all doing right now.
that is
Yep.
exactly right.
Yep.
Exactly right. So let me get to some of the challenges around the transition to a more robust vote at home system. First of all, uh, for those of us who are sort of election nerds, what are the operational challenges in transitioning from a, let's say, the precinct-based voting to vote at home? What are the top three or four things there?
Sure. So, when we shifted from a precinct-based system in Denver, and we did it over a few years in a lot of ways because we kind of made incremental changes to our vote by mail procedures. But then we quickly transitioned to an all vote by mail once the legislation passed. And so, there's a lot of things to consider. First and foremost, I always talk about how it's a comprehensive, system. And so, if we're going to get you a ballot, we need to know where you are. So your voter registration needs to be up to date, your address needs to be up to date, and there's mechanisms that we can put in place now that help with that. So for instance, national change of address database through the post office lets people know, and you can put your address change in there. One thing that we do in Colorado and a lot of western states do now is they run their entire voter registration file against that postal database every month to glean address changes off of that and then proactively update address records based on that. And the reason that's great is that reduces the voter from having to fill out another piece of paper with the election office, but it also it increases our chances of getting the ballot to the right place, because ballots are not forwardable. So that's kind of an example of where it actually starts at the voter registration process. And then there's other things like equipment needs. So assessing, does a county have an ability to centrally count and tabulate the ballots that come in? Are they a large county and do they need additional equipment to receive ballots? So there are devices called ballot sorters, there's extraction envelope equipment. So there's lots of equipment that goes into it as well. And it's different type of equipment than what election officials are used to in precinct-based operations, and it actually requires less of a footprint. So you don't need a big giant warehouse housing a lot of voting machines as maybe you used to, because most of your voting and most of your, well, actually all of your ballots will be cast on a piece of paper, even those that come in through military voters, because there's a paper record established with everything, and everything gets centrally counted. So there's this sort of environment of a central tabulation center where all ballots essentially come into. So I kind of like to say that it's almost like you're boosting up your internal operations because you're sending the ballots out and then they're coming back in to be processed, and that's where most of your election activity will take place.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. In the midst of all this, as we were encouraging people to think about voting at home, I got a call from a guy who was a retired printer who did a lot of direct mail processing,
Uh-huh.
and he said, I know how to do this. He
Yeah,
said, help me, just point me to your election officials so I can advise them on how to process and sort and open and bundle and
right.
all that kind of stuff. And that struck me, as you said, that's a kind of competence that we haven't really developed in our voting, our election operations. So
Well, it's a competence that's definitely been developed in Western states. So
yeah,
there's a ton of experts across the spectrum, and what's great about this right now, I think, for states that don't have a ton of vote at home provisions, is there's actually a lot of experts that have figured we've had to go through the pain of implementing this, and we've developed really good procedures, and so there is a way to scale it right now
sure,
because there are some really great county officials and state officials that have implemented this and can share their knowledge and share their best practices. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do at the National Vote at Home Institute, is be that conduit and be that advisor to states on how best to do that.
Yeah.
And we've been collecting the best practices and providing trainings and all of that because there's no need to reinvent the wheel. It's been done well, and it's really about replicating what's been done in a good way in various states.
Sure, and that's the advantage of the fact that voting is a state and county and locally managed business. Let me ask you about another aspect of the challenges of transition, which is sort of the the fears in voters' minds, the perceptual challenges. You know, when I talk about this to people, sometimes I tweeted something about voting at home the other day, and guy responded to me, you know, voting by mail is an invitation to wholesale fraud. I
Right.
also hear people say, "I'm not sure I trust the post office to get my ballot back home." So those are two examples of fears that voters have. But how do you respond to those? How do you respond to other concerns that you hear coming up?
Sure. Well, those specifically, I think it's again, it's all about the system, and I always say that it's much more than just mailing a ballot out. And there's things like ballot tracking tools, which we actually created the first in the country in Denver back in 2009, and that tool allows voters to sign up with an email or a cell phone number, and they get essentially just like a FedEx package. You get tracking info about the status of your mail ballot. So when it's at the post office, when it's out for delivery to you, and then all the way back again, you get an actual confirmation for when your ballot's been received, and then when it goes into the counting room, you get that full transparency of where it is. So
Sure.
that's one of the tools I always suggest as being critical for not only the security, but also the communication aspect and giving voters confidence in where their ballot is. The other piece is, we have to empower individuals with options and give them an ability to vote without relying on either structures, entities, or third parties. And, one of the examples we saw in North Carolina in 2018 was voters were being taken advantage of by bad actors that were offering to collect their ballots and take them in to be dropped off. And what's interesting about that is one thing I've suggested is, well, if the county would have offered prepaid postage, voters would not have had to give their ballots to somebody else. They could have just mailed it themselves, right? So it again goes to when you streamline the voting process and you make it better for voters individually and give the individuals the power to decide what works best for them, decide if they want to mail it through the post office or if they want to go drop it off in person, we can eliminate some of those challenges with people being taken advantage of.
Yeah.
The other aspect is penalties in each state's laws about things like intimidation or interfering with a drop box, just like they are a felony for a postal box. They also have to be that same strict felony provisions for anybody that tries to do those things. Most states have provisions against intimidation, but if they don't, they need to have those things in place because it's not even just mail ballots. Those things happen in droves outside of polling places. And we had when I was running Denver's election, we would get complaints all the time about people being either intimidated outside of a polling place or harassed at their houses, or maybe mailers sent to their house that had the wrong information on it. What's interesting is I think also a lot of people sort of discount or ignore all of the issues like that in the in-person voting structure. While talking about the new possibility of other options, they kind of ignore a lot of those problems that exist in the in-person voting structure as well.
Yeah.
The other safeguards that we have in place are things like signature verification, and there's really good methods and training and standards that have been developed in Western states on that. Um, and while that has to be a fair process, so that if a signature doesn't match, there's a way for a voter to cure that. We also want to make sure that there's enough time for voters to cure that, and those provisions are in place in a good way. So those are all the kind of policy related matters that touch on those two issues that you brought up. We have not seen significant increases, for instance, in cases referred to the district attorneys specifically about vote by mail. We've not seen those things happen in states that have rolled this out broadly, partly because of those provisions I mentioned that are in place that prevent those things from happening.
Yeah, that's a great point you make about people sort of blithely ignoring the challenges of voting in person as they consider vote by voting at home. You know,
Well, and one example, just real quickly, I always say to people, is interfering with the election a 5-hour line, or is it worse that voters walk away from a 5-hour, like, then nothing could be more intimidating to a voter, or frankly more fraudulent, than voters being faced with lines that are so long that they literally can't physically stay there, for whatever reason. We just saw a story out of Florida in their recent primary where a gentleman had to leave the line because he was running out of oxygen. He didn't
oh,
have enough oxygen to stay in line any longer, right? And when we see stories like that, that exposes some of those other issues with in-person voting beyond a pandemic. Just simply having to wait that long in line is impossible for many people.
yeah. Well, and yeah, we got to, without naming names locally, it feels to me sometimes our local election officials treat long lines or other inadequacies, broken machines or whatever at the polls as like it's an act of God. It just sort of happened, but it's very predictable and knowable, and that's something, to my mind, you have to manage to. I
Yes.
just note that, the Committee of 70 was founded in 1904
Yeah.
to combat the in-person intimidation and thuggery that was going on at the polls. So here we are 116 years later with just a different challenge.
Yeah.
Uh, so Pennsylvania, as you know, fortuitously expanded vote at home privileges last fall in an act of
Yeah.
the legislature, and without any knowledge, of course, that we were going to entering into this public health crisis. And there's sort of a debate right now as to whether we should sort of, as it were, rip the Band-Aid and just say, let's send everybody a ballot, or take a more play it as it goes kind of approach and say, well, why don't we just encourage people, but take this in a little more cautious, more measured approach. You have an opinion on which one of those makes most sense?
I do. And, we're actually seeing this play out in the state of Wisconsin right now. So they had about 120,000 or so applications about 10 days ago, maybe close to 2 weeks ago. That's gone up to 1 million in less than 2 weeks. And the local election officials are completely overwhelmed with processing all of those applications. And what I've been saying is, look, it's actually less expensive and more efficient for local election officials to mail a ballot automatically, because this process of making the local election officials process all these applications and then send the ballot, the total cost of that transaction is close to $15 when you sort of add in all the elements of processing, the data entry, the then preparing of the ballot, the sending of the ballot, and then processing it on the back end. It's very expensive when it would actually be, more like $2 a ballot to mail the ballot automatically. So we're seeing counties spend a ton of money on this right now. Georgia just opted to send applications to every voter, and I've been saying to some of the officials there, we'll expect the numbers like what you're seeing in Wisconsin, where you're going to be completely inundated with a lot of people asking for their ballot that way. Then they still have to send the ballot out after they get all that paperwork done. So it's a very inefficient process, actually. And given the crunch timeline that we have, I actually believe it is more feasible, and it takes less burden. It takes more burden off of the local election officials to do an automatic kind of ballot situation. And that's my advice to Pennsylvania. I think especially given this pandemic, while it's great that Pennsylvania lifted some of the restrictions on vote by mail, they're probably going to have to jump even further, because this pandemic is really making it enormously challenging and frankly completely unreasonable to have in-person voting in this environment with stay-at-home orders and shelter-in-place orders and all those sorts of things. You cannot, vote in person. The final thing I would say on that is the only primaries that have continued without being disrupted are Oregon's is still on slate to have their primary as scheduled. Three primaries are happening this week: Hawaii, Alaska, and Wyoming. all of which have mailed ballots to every voter. And those are state party run primaries, and I helped to advise on some of them. But they came and asked me last fall, we have to run our primary. The election officials in the state don't run the primary, it's the party. How do we do it? And I said, I would send a ballot to everyone, offer ranked choice voting because you have a ton of candidates running for president, and have all the ballots come back into a central place with prepaid postage. So they're literally running their elections right now in exactly the way that I would recommend states run it for not only the upcoming primaries, but for the fall. And they've got voters voting, they've got record turnout, even in a pandemic. And the only thing they've had to adjust is they've gotten rid of their in-person voting. Kansas is doing the same thing come May 2nd for their party-run primary. So those are the only elections that haven't been disrupted, and voters are continuing to vote because they had that option.
That's very smart. Talk a little bit about I know you just released maybe a week or so ago, your kind of national strategy that embodies a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about, sort of advice to states, and take a minute to plug your website as well.
Sure. So our website is voteathome.org. And we did release a plan. We released a strategy plan that not only talks about some of the policies and the considerations that states are faced with, but also a decision tree. It kind of lays out the three different options that states have in front of them, depending on where they are in the spectrum, if you will, of voting at home. And then we outline how to actually do it. So a lot of groups are putting out policy recommendations right now, but ours is really about policy, and then how do you do it? How do you actually make this work in a realistic way? And we hope that all the secretaries of state around the country are looking at it. We hope election officials are looking at it, because it does outline how a lot of these things can be done. And then as a follow to that, we're working with a lot of our key partners on putting out toolkits, putting out checklists, putting out different resources like a timeline and suggestions on how state and locals can actually do this. So a lot of that is going to come in the next week or two, from various groups that have been hard at work on this. And the final thing I would say about that is, again, our website is voteathome.org. In addition to the strategy plan, we also have all of our training materials, best practices, research on this topic in a reference library that's on our website, that's really accessible, and it's a great tool for folks to use.
That's great. Um, we used to have a tourism slogan in Pennsylvania that you've got a friend in Pennsylvania. Uh,
Oh,
you moved on to other slogans. I always thought that was a pretty good one.
yeah.
But in the Committee of 70, know that you've got a friend in Pennsylvania. So
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. You guys have been a great partner. We really appreciate it.
you were doing great work. I wanted you just to give you a quick moment to talk about your fairly new book
Sure.
that's out called When Women Vote.
Yep. That's right. When Women Vote is a book that I wrote with one of my best friends. Um, and what we did is we interviewed women around the country about their voting experience in 2018. And one of the things that we actually call for in the book is expanded vote at home options. We published it, we put it out in January before all of this started. Obviously, we wrote it over the course of 2019. But what's interesting is when we interviewed those various women, all had very different experiences, but all had, except for one, had challenges with the experience that was in front of them. And so in our book, we advocate for expanding vote at home options. We also talk about the need to modernize voter registration processes, along with automating the voter registration process. We also talk about the need for redistricting reform and fair processes and procedures around that. And then we highlight the need for ranked choice voting in primary elections and other elections as a tool to improve the voting process overall. But we highlight a lot of these things in our book. It's a short read. It's available on Amazon. It's also on Kindle now. Whenwomenvote.org is the landing page for our website. And it was really fun to highlight. And part of the reason we call it When Women Vote, it applies to everyone, but given that we're in the centennial of women's suffrage, we wanted to tell the story of the need for this through the eyes of various women voters around the country. And we also interviewed two amazing women secretaries of state, both Jocelyn Benson in Michigan and then Kim Wyman in Washington, who both articulate the need for nonpartisan voting reform that makes the process easier for all voters, regardless of your partisan stripes. We just want to improve the process for everyone, and they articulate that really well in the book as well.
That's great. I am just in the midst of a book called The Woman's Hour that maybe you might have read about
Yeah,
the political fight to secure the 36th state to ratify the
that's right.
19th Amendment in 1920. So it sounds like this would be a good companion to that.
Yes, it would, and it's a quick read. We didn't want to make it a huge academic book that nobody would, want to want to read, but it's very consumable. It's we've had a lot of great feedback, a lot of great support on it. So I would encourage you to read it.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Amber, for joining us. Thanks for your terrific work, and look forward to working with you in the future to get a lot of this important stuff done, because these are extraordinary times. And I think as a self-styled democracy entrepreneur,
Yep.
that you understand the great opportunity that the crisis presents us. So um,
Yep.
we'll do the best we can to take advantage of the opening.
Yes, and thank you for your partnership. We really appreciate it.
Great. Talk to you soon.